My name is Matt Ludvigson. I'm a graphic designer, and these are my watches.
Well, Matt, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Before we look at your watches, I want to take a step back. Graphic designer. Tell us a little bit more about what you do. How does this all connect to watches too? Because we hear about design and watches as like this strange little marriage. So I want to hear a little bit more about your background and then how this all kind of came to be where you got this interest in watches.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, graphic design is a very wide discipline. We have, many different ways that you could approach it. From my standpoint, it's mostly branding. That's basically my background in that. And design to me is you're very intentional about what you're doing. So you're making something that's very useful, but is also beautiful. And to me, that parlays right into watches. I mean, when we look at a watch, it's a beautiful, useful tool. Mm-hmm. And we see graphic design in this, we see industrial design through this, and we see all sorts of icy sculpture and these things like that. I think it dovetails very easily together.
And then most of the work that you're doing, like in terms of like day to day, I mean, what kind of work is that? It's, because graphic design is this all-encompassing idea too, right?
So a lot of it's digital now, of course, right? But even before that, you're working with logos. You're working with websites. Extension items, different ways to bring people's personality through brands out. The thing about design is you're not usually designing for yourself. You're designing to an audience and you're trying to use someone's voice to reach them. So through that way, you're kind of being a conduit or you're being a translator for that individual or company.
So where do you want to start? I'm looking at this tray here and I see things to me that make total sense as with your background. And then I see other watches where I'm like, why did you pick that one? But where do you want to begin?
Well, let's start with the Max Bill. I think that makes all the sense in the world,
That's
right?
one of the ones that made sense.
Right, and this is a watch I know you know all about, and one that is something that you certainly are familiar with. But we're looking at Junghans Max Bill, and this to me is a designer's watch. I mean, we talk about Bauhaus watches. You hear that thrown around a lot, right?
Yes.
There are Bauhaus watches, and there are Bauhaus watches, and this is the latter. In Max Bill, we're talking about a master of design, right? And in this way, that's the other thing I love about design is when you make something, you're not really there to talk to someone, but a design does communicate with somebody. So in a way, Max Bill's kind of talking to us through this design, and it's great. I mean, it's stayed relatively unchanged for all these years, right?
This watch was one of the first watches, I remember I saw it, and it just clicked when I saw it. And then you hear the backstory about starts as a clock, transitions into a watch, and then you connect the dots of seeing it as a wristwatch now, and it just makes sense. You can see that transition, the way the curvature of the dial, the way it kind of pops out at you. It's a beautiful design, and I've always loved the numerals. I remember being on a lunch break when I was, formerly just had a job, and then I would just see a watch, and I'd be like, oh, I have to have this. This was like one of those watches I saw this. It was just total fixation for me. It's beautiful, and it's you either get it or you don't. And we also just see now, I feel, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but you see a lot of the design that's on display here being in other parts of our lives now. Like
of course.
The lineage of that design of Bauhaus school design.
And Max Bill is one of the biggest figures in all of that, of course, Swiss design and all that. On top of that, I'm glad you brought out the scalability point because great design is scalable. So this design works as a wall clock, which is considerably larger than this, and it works all the way down, and I think all the way down to, if I'm not mistaken, 34 millimeters, which is the original.
For the handling,
They made it a little larger here, but at any of those scales, this design is cohesive and holds together. I think there's a lot of watches that can't say that, right, or designs in general. There's nothing that's out of place on this dial, and I think that's such a testament to great design. But there's also nothing on here that doesn't need to be there. Everything about it is clean, and you can tell that every detail's been touched and considered by a designer. And there's also a lot of elegance to this, but there's a lot of humility to it too. And I love that about this piece. I chose this for my wedding watch, in fact.
Oh, fantastic.
Because I just think it's that right mix of elegance and humility and beauty all wrapped into a single piece.
Awesome. So you have two Rolex watches. Now,
I do.
Design and Rolex, I think that's one thing they do very well, but you decided to pick two very distinct examples that I would say one is like the pure essence of what many people think of Rolex, and another one that's more of an oddball. So you want to go through those?
Yeah, let's start with the oddball. I assume you're talking about the Explorer too, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So I think when this one came out, it confused a lot of people. I don't think this was their most popular model for a while. And there's just a lot about this that I love, starting with just the pure white dial. I mean, you really actually don't see that so often in watches where they go really for the pure white dial. The other aspect about this is it's very utilitarian to me. The design elements that are on here for a reason, and they're done in a way that is to be legible and useful all across the board. This to me is a pure expression of what a tool watch is, right? And Rolex really has that heritage, right? You know, but it's also kind of, the brand has this aspect of it that carries with it quite a bit of power. That's also really interesting to me being a brander. If you go anywhere in the world, for the most part, you can say the word Rolex and people know what you're talking about. And that to me is incredible. It takes a lot of work to do something like that and build a brand like that. But you think of like McDonald's or Coca-Cola, like you need those things to survive. You don't need those things, but.
Maybe don't need McDonald's.
Yeah, maybe not McDonald's to survive. No offense, McDonald's, but still love you. But that aspect of it too is really interesting to me. And you can get caught up in brands a little too much, but at the same time, I'm a brander. I mean, that's just part of it. The watch itself, though, I mean, very wearable. It just begs to be taken on adventures. It's called the Explorer, right? This is a watch I had on my wrist when my brother and I over the summer climbed Mount Washington, for instance. You really had to have that one, you know. And when we got to the top, it kept kind of reminding me on my wrist that, like, you need to be worthy of the name in a way. You know, it's kind of silly that way, but it's a good way to think about some of these watches.
Yeah, I own this watch too.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, the 16570, I've always loved it as probably my favorite reference from the Explorer 2 line. And it's also the oddball within the oddball because different case, you're also seeing, you know, the red pop with the GMT hand versus the traditional orange. It is its own creation, and I just love how versatile it is, and the contrast of that dial I think always spoke to me too.
White on black,
Yeah, it's beautiful. And then you have Submariner, but it's very specific Submariner. This is what I would say probably one of the purest approaches to a Submariner.
Yeah, and to me, one of the icons of watches, I look at this and I say, if you had watch in the dictionary, this would probably be the watch that'd be next to it. Submariner is, it's a bar of which many watches are compared to, right? And its iconic design, again, like we were talking about a little bit with the Max Bill, I think it's got everything it needs and nothing it doesn't. It's very purpose-based, and it's still very beautiful in all of those aesthetics. It's also remained relatively unchanged, you know, with some different updates to it, but for what, 50, 60, 70 years is it now? Yeah. And the 5513 to me, or the 5512 in this era, is where it really hit its stride and is kind of that iconic design that's been carried through now all these years.
That was the turning point where you see now a modern Submariner now, and you can recognize it dating back to this. I mean, the 5512 and 5513.
Yeah, and talk about lasting design. I mean, like we said, 70 years, something like that. And it's relatively unchanged. It's still highly sought after. It clearly resonates with people all these years. And like the other watch, it kind of has this built-in idea of adventure. This to me is a watch that's a true icon in every way.
Symmetry's there, both from top, from across, 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock. I look at the 2 line up top, I see the 2 line below, it's at 6. I mean, it is very pure.
Yep, and from my perspective on a personal level, I purchased this and it's been obviously used. I actually think that's really cool too.
Yep.
I would love to have a minty fresh version just to see it and to know where every mark came from. But this has all these dings and marks. It's been polished, maybe a little too much on one side. But someone wore this and loved it, you know, and they used it the way it was intended to be used. And that, I think, is really important with watches, too, is they actually wear them and use them.
Yeah, I'm glad you're not afraid to wear your Submariner. That can't be said by everybody. But now we get into a couple other watches. I'm looking here, and if this is okay, we can go here next. Ones that, when I was mentioning at the beginning, you know, why did he pick these? Because they're not maybe the watches I think of as much when you think of graphic design or just, you know, what maybe a graphic designer would have, but you decided to pick them, 2 dive watches. So maybe you want to start with the bright color orange here that's screaming at us.
Yeah, let's go with the wild one. Yeah, the Doxa 300, the Sub 300. And the Doxa Sub 300 is, it is really its own thing, isn't it? Can we say there's anything else that really looks like a Doxa Sub 300? I'll go so far as to say, I don't know if I picked this up from somewhere or if it's one of my own thoughts, but I think there's something to the right kind of ugly. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
There's some things that are so, they're just, the best I've figured out is that they're very purpose made. And everything that's on them is made for that purpose. But what you get is this thing that doesn't have a conventional beauty to it. But it's still very compelling. You know, I think of other products like some trucks or, you know, maybe different items in the world that are very built for that. That you look at them at first glance and you think, man, that thing's really hideous. But they grow on you. I don't think the 300 is hideous. I just think it really hits you in a different way the first time you see it. And I think everyone knows what I'm talking about.
Of course.
The first time you see a Doxa Sub 300, you're like, what on earth is that? You know, every detail about it. This one is really important to me personally too because of how it came to me and who made it available to me. You know, a couple gentlemen who I respect immensely and are friends, and I really think of them every time I wear this as well, so it's got a lot of personal connection to me too.
It's a cool watch. There's nothing else like it in a way. I mean, and you know, talk about design too, tying it back in. Like the orange dial was decided because of its legibility underwater when they were testing these out in like Lake Neuchâtel. Like the orange just worked. I mean, that's what informed the design more than anything else.
Right, and what watch is more iconic for a color? I struggle to think of one, you know, than Doxa and the orange on the dial.
Then another, more of an obscure diver.
Yes, yeah, and sort of gleaned from maybe that same era, right? We have the Aquastar and the Deep Star too. This one is kind of a modern take on what the Deep Star was with the chronograph edition. And Rick really did a nice job of bringing in all those elements and design into something really special and beautiful. And we have this bizarre asymmetry going on in this, right? And we were talking about even these indices with the facets on them, I guess you'd call those. And they just jump out at you. Everything about this watch begs you to do this, right? You want to move it around and look at it from every angle. And again, it's kind of got that right kind of ugly going on, right? Where everything on this is mostly put there for a very good reason.
The markers are enormous on that.
Enormous, yeah, enormous. But it just adds to all of it. And this is just, to me, again, like, that's the other aspect. If you look at these two, again, mid-century design languages, very different. But you can see where it comes through, right? Where that design language is coming through.
This seems to be a very well-worn watch. What were you doing with this one?
I've taken this attempting to dive in Lake Michigan, and you're
more than what I can say.
Yeah, right. Well, we'll get you out there someday. Yeah, you got a lot of people around you now.
I know I do.
And yeah, it's got a couple battle wounds probably from our friend Ben trying to crowbar me into a wetsuit that was too small. And we won't blame the wetsuit. It was me that was too big for the wetsuit. But yeah, it also makes me think of those guys. I met a lot of great friends who somehow I've found myself in this group of very serious divers. Didn't see that one coming on my bingo card, but I love those guys, and they're great. They're all watch guys. Really, really interesting crew of guys. So shout out to them. I always think of them when I wear this.
Where would you like to go next?
Let's go over to, let's try the Tudor, huh?
Okay.
Let's go that direction.
Sure.
And this is very different in the sense that, you know, we were talking about this a little bit before too, that what do you say about a 58? That hasn't been said. I mean, it's pretty much a perfect watch, right? To me, the blue with Tudor, right, is a really big deal with their history. When you have a blue Tudor dive watch, that to me has its own thing going on.
Great.
And maybe like black dial in the 50, I absolutely love those at 54, but you start maybe talking about a Submariner more when you see those together. A blue 58 Tudor is just really from that kind of same lineage of some of those really legendary dive watches. But again, you have the complete symmetry, you have no date. How can you argue? I mean, the way this wears on the wrist, everything about it. Again, I think it's become clear that, you know, with some of the vintage watches that the designer actually wore them. They tried these watches on and they wore them around to experience how it feels to wear these. And I get that sense of the 58. I feel like someone's really worn this and figured out what's comfortable about a watch. And you get all that through it.
Again, I own this watch too. You have a couple of watches on the table here that I also have in my collection, so good taste, whatever that means, and it's all subjective, but I mean this, again, it's almost like this ineffable idea with this watch. You can't really explain why it works so well at a point. I mean, it just does, and if you're spending $4,000, you really can't do much better.
Yeah, maybe you have this problem too. Maybe as a designer, I feel sometimes that I need to be unique, or I have to have things that are very unique, but I've also come back on that and looked at icons and why things are so popular. Sometimes you find out why. And it's difficult to argue with great design, and I think that's a testament also to great design as well.
Yeah, we like to be contrarians at times as collectors, just because we want something different.
Right.
We want to hate the thing that's popular, but sometimes it just works, and that's one of the watches that does.
Yeah, you walk into a group and the same guy's wearing the same watch as you, it feels a little odd, doesn't it? But sometimes there's also that connection, and that feeling that you understand the same thing they do.
Another Tudor, though.
Yeah,
a little bit different this time, though.
Right, yeah, and again, this is probably one of those watches on the table that maybe doesn't make sense, particularly for a smaller wrist. That I have, but the Tudor, this is the Monte Carlo, or it used to be called the Monte Carlo, now they call it the Heritage Chrono Blue. But that does come from that old design, which I think is one of the greatest designs in all watches. You know what I'm talking about, from the 70s.
Early 1970s.
Yeah, and what a crazy watch, right? And I think they really pulled that through on this. But you get this very loud, large watch, and talk about a sport watch. Very colorful. There's a lot going on in this. Very different than something like the Junghans, for instance, of course. But the blue flies out at you. I mean, look at the colors on this thing. Like I would love to be in the meeting where someone pitched this to the board at Tudor. You know, like what must that have been like, you know, to have this watch to come out and to try and move this design forward into production. But everything about it is just wild. This makes me think of I grew up in eastern Wisconsin. Over there we have Road America, which is this beautiful race course, legendary in history as well. And it just has all that vibe. It's kind of got like the Steve McQueen thing going on.
Of course.
It's got all of that, right? Like the glory years of racing. It just screams fun and speed and summer.
And shapes, colors.
Yeah.
It shouldn't work, but it does.
Right, yep. And then on the wrist, it wears well enough for me, even though it's a very bulky, large watch. But what a great piece.
The next piece I'm seeing right next to it, Stowa.
Yeah, now for something entirely different, right?
Bouncing all over the place here.
Yes, yeah, and
love
this
it.
is very classic design. What I like about this design, you'll see a lot on deck watches, they don't have this clean numeral set, right? They're a little bit more flourished and all that. But this is that very strict design language that I think is absolutely beautiful. And again, there's really nothing on here that shouldn't be. But they've paid attention to all the details in the design. I mean, the blued hands are just beautiful if you see it move through, right? This, again, very stark, beautiful white dial, extremely legible. And this also screams nautical to me, which I think you're starting to see maybe a theme of that. That's a big part of my life in terms of Great Lakes history in particular. And I like to pour something strong sometimes in our basement, which is filled with Great Lakes memorabilia and just look at old charts or something.
Sure,
Very, old soul, I guess. But this really pulls that out for me, and it wears absolutely beautiful. Very thin, great proportions, and just completely classic design.
It's a beautiful watch. I mean, and also just in terms of what you can do for the money there, I mean, it's a great deal too.
Incredible value in that watch, and the attention to detail. Hand wind, really beautiful.
Next piece, this one, I'd like your take on this too and why you were drawn to this watch, because this comes from an element of design that uses a lot of information and trying to squeeze it on a very small area.
Yep, and that to me is the absolute brilliance of this, right? It's chaos ordered. But that's half the fun of it. The other half of the fun of this for me is all that information visually is a massive challenge. But look at how they've done it. And you still have this beautiful symmetry coming through. Everything's in the right place. You've got that beautiful blue dial. There's so much depth and interest going on in this piece, but they held it all together through some form of symmetry and visual balance between negative space, I guess you'd say in this situation, and a lot of positive space, a lot of information. But yeah, that is chaos in order right there.
That's one way to put it, for sure. I mean, like, coming from this Navitimer type of design, and just it works beautifully. I mean, Sinn loved the brand. I mean, I always
one of my favorites.
Adore them. Speaking of chronographs,
yes,
another one here, the Speedy Broad Arrow.
Yeah, the Broad Arrow, not the one you usually would see, I suppose. I previously did own the Professional, the Moonwatch, famously. And again, talk about an icon, right on par probably with that Submariner.
Be right up there in the dictionary right next to it, probably.
Yeah, be way up there, and what a legend, right? And for good reason, and all the story behind it. But what you get with this piece that I really enjoy is that Broad Arrow handset. And there's something way different about this. When that thing flies out at you, and I think Omega's got one of the best handsets in the business.
Agreed.
The design that's like this is sort of as you start to talk about the Tudor, where it's like someone took a real chance on that. And it really pays off. And you kind of move this thing around, it plays with the light differently. It's got legibility issues, to be frank. You can see why they moved to a different handset. But it also pulls back to that wild kind of the roots of the Speedmaster being like a racing watch. And I just love how they've done that. The steel bezel on the outside, right? All those things come together in this piece in just such a beautiful way. It makes it really unique. They had a very regrettable name for it when it first came out. So you don't see this one too often. I think that it played in with it, but it's really caught on these later years. And I often pair this on a NATO or off its bracelet because there's so much steel. Today I have it actually on a piece of leather that was put together by a friend of mine, Alex Gravel out of town.
Cool.
He makes beautiful straps.
Nice little rally strap, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful.
What made you acquire this one?
Well, like I said, I had the Professional, and I just kept seeing this one over and over again. There was something about it that pulled me in. And I thought they were very undervalued. That also helps, right? Where you can see you could maybe get a little bit more for your money there. But I couldn't forget this piece. And I'm a designer. I mean, I have to be honest. I often shop with my eyes, right? As most people do, I'm sure. But if I see a compelling piece of design, I'm drawn in.
When you first look at a watch, because I'm trying to almost get in your brain here as like a designer, like where do your eyes go first?
I mean, right to the dial. I think that's probably where it all starts for me. But I do try and take a 10,000-foot view and just see the whole picture of the thing. But even then, yeah, I mean, a dial can really compel me. And there's so much to that. There's arrangement of the way they've put the elements together. There's color, you name it. I mean, it's just like the design principles. And like we said in the beginning when we're talking about where design dovetails with watches. I mean, all those principles are in practice on these. And they all matter. Everywhere you put something on a watch really affects it. Not only the way it looks, but the way it's used. So they're great design challenges.
They are, and you're dealing with very limited space to do so.
Yes.
Which I always think that's the kind of fun challenge of it all.
Right.
And then to round us out here, we have some final watches on the table looking more towards the military aspect, which, if you're speaking of design too, in being recognizable, this whole family of watch design, I mean, you could argue is as strong as any and as timeless as any.
Right, and we talk about, maybe we could pull in field watches to this. We could talk about the Hamilton in that way as well. But these do have their root mostly in military, and I think there's something else really compelling to this idea of designing for utility, right? And military watches are a very good example of that. But what often results is so beautiful. And it kind of gets back to that right kind of ugly idea, where if you set out and you make something purpose-made, usually you end up with something beautiful because it works. It makes sense.
So why CWC? Like, what drew you to them?
CWC is a fantastic brand, actually one of my favorites right now in this moment. But it is I would say for them, it's kind of like you're getting a piece of kit right out of a standard issue or something. I didn't serve, I can't claim any of that. It also does remind me of some service from my grandfathers. One fought at Iwo Jima, and the other actually was in the OSS. Some of that pulls in with the watches of espionage strap on this one, and reminds me of some of their service and the things they went through and the kind of men they were. Both extremely humble, fantastic role models growing up. But CWC in general, I think, just really hits it. It feels like you're getting a watch the day it was made from decades ago on both of them. And what fantastic designs, again, made for either infantry or pilots, is my understanding with these. And what you got was just one of the most compelling, beautiful designs in these asymmetry, layouts.
Yeah, beautiful watches.
Yeah,
again, in terms of value for money as well, and history to lean on.
Yeah, unless, that's a good segue into Hamilton.
Of course.
Like, who does that better in a way, right? With the 38 mechanical, again, what do we need to say about
on
this
a bracelet?
That hasn't been said, right?
On a bracelet too.
Yes, and back in the day, you couldn't get these on bracelet. And I actually ended up purchasing a bracelet separately and throwing it on. I used to have a white dial variant. And I thought that just completely made this watch. It's fantastic on a NATO or whatever it used to come on. But there's something about this watch on a bracelet that just really ties in. And Hamilton was really the first brand that got me into watches at all, in the sense of before, when I was a kid, looking at fossils in the display case with my brother and geeking out about that. Hamilton's the one that kind of set me down the path of mechanical. It is sickness we have, and whatever it is, right?
It was one of the first ones for me too, and there's like the field design. I look at entry points of like where somebody could get infected with the sickness.
Right, yeah.
Like, this is an entry point. I think Junghans for me as well was another one. Whenever I would show that to people that weren't really into watches, there's elements of design where it's easier to take the plunge than others. And something like that, it's so easy to digest, it just makes sense. It's simple, it's clean, and it also has history that really informs its design.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you kind of talk about those, and in particular these, because I don't think I'm going to ruffle any feathers or offend anyone. We present ourselves very differently, right? Your hair's all on top of your head, mine's on the bottom, but
we're upside down.
We're upside down. I'm the upside down one, but it looks right at home on your wrist, and it looks right at home on mine, and that's a testament to me to great design. It doesn't try to do anything that describes anything other than just the beauty of the piece, and it works. Many of these are very purpose-built for something else, and I doubt we could say the same for some of these in terms of, it kind of works with some and works with others. But great design to me is universal, and I think these really hit on that.
Well, Matt, amazing collection, amazing insight as well through your lens as a designer. Thank you for doing this, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great fun. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, take care.